He drifted through the American landscape like a whisper of smoke, a man whose presence was so faint that he left almost no trace, save for the bodies he left in his wake. Samuel Little is not a name that echoes with the same terrifying familiarity as other monsters of the modern age. There are no films, no television dramas that chronicle his movements. He was not a showman. He did not seek fame or taunt the police with cryptic letters. His evil was a quiet, patient, and deeply personal thing, a darkness that he carried with him from town to town, a burden he shared only with the women he killed. He would eventually be named the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States, a title earned not through theatrical brutality, but through a staggering, relentless efficiency that preyed on the forgotten and the ignored. His story is a chilling indictment of the fractures in the world he inhabited, a tale of how a man could murder for decades, not because he was a genius, but because the system he operated within was blind to his victims. The man who became this phantom was born Samuel McDowell in a small town in Georgia, a place that offered little and took even less. His life began in a state of poverty and instability, a pattern that would define his entire existence. He was a drifter from the moment he could walk, a rootless soul who never had a true home. This lack of anchor was both his curse and his greatest weapon. He learned to be a chameleon, to blend in, to become whatever was necessary to survive. He was also a fighter. He found a certain kind of solace and power in the boxing ring, a place where his rage and his strength were channeled into a sanctioned form of violence. He was good at it too. The ring taught him how to use his body as a weapon, how to deliver a blow with a precision and force that could incapacitate a man in an instant. This skill, this knowledge of how to inflict maximum damage with minimal effort, would become the signature of his later, more horrific crimes. His life outside the ring was a relentless cycle of transgression. He was a career criminal in the truest sense of the word, a man who was more comfortable in the back of a police car than in a real home. His rap sheet, a document that would stretch for pages if ever fully compiled, was a litany of small-time crimes: shoplifting, fraud, armed robbery, assault, kidnapping, and rape. He was arrested over and over again, a familiar face in jails and prisons across the country. These incarcerations were like brief pauses in a long, violent song. He would be locked up for a few months or a couple of years, then released, only to fall back into his old patterns. The system saw him as a nuisance, a petty thief, a small-time hoodlum. They saw the surface-level crimes but never looked deep enough to see the abyss that lay beneath. He was hiding in plain sight, his monstrous nature masked by the sheer volume of his lesser offenses. He was a known quantity, but what he was known for was all wrong. This constant movement was the key to his longevity as a killer. He did not have a hunting ground in the traditional sense. His hunting ground was the entire country. He would drift into a city, stay for weeks or months, and then move on, often under the pressure of an arrest warrant for a minor offense. This transient lifestyle was his greatest asset. A body discovered in Los Angeles could not be easily connected to one found in Miami or in Cincinnati. There were no patterns for a single police department to spot, no geographical signature for a profiler to trace. Samuel Little was a one-man crime wave scattered like confetti across a map of the United States. Each murder an isolated island in a vast ocean of unsolved cases. He was a ghost who haunted the margins, a killer whose success was a direct reflection of society's apathy. His methodology was as simple as it was horrifyingly effective. He was a predator of opportunity, and his weapon of choice was his own body. He would stalk his victims, often in areas known for prostitution and drug use, and he would approach them. His charm was a lure. He would offer them drugs, money, or a ride, presenting himself as just another person on the margins. Once he had lured a victim to a secluded location, an alley, a cheap motel room, the depths of a park, he would strike. There was no grand ritual, no prolonged torture. There was only the swift, brutal efficiency of a trained boxer. He would deliver a powerful punch to the head or face, rendering the woman unconscious instantly. Then, as she lay helpless, he would strangle her with his bare hands. This method was perfect for a killer who wished to remain undetected. It left no bullet casings, no knife wounds, no DNA from a weapon. The primary cause of death, strangulation, was often difficult to prove, especially on a decomposed body. In many cases, the only external sign of violence might be a bruise or a broken jaw, which could easily be misinterpreted or overlooked entirely. This physical ambiguity was a gift to a killer who targeted the forgotten. When the body of a black woman with a history of drug use was found with no obvious signs of trauma, the path of least resistance for an overworked and under-resourced coroner's office was to rule the death an accident, a drug overdose, or undetermined. Samuel Little knew this. He understood that the system he operated within was biased and that the lives he took were not considered valuable enough to warrant a deep, expensive investigation. He was not just killing women, he was killing them in a way that ensured the system itself would help him cover his tracks. His choice of victims was the most chilling and calculated aspect of his crimes. Samuel Little preyed almost exclusively on women, and the vast majority of them were black. Many were involved in sex work or struggled with addiction, living lives that placed them on the very edge. Violent nature masked by the petty crimes that constantly brought him to the attention of the law. He was the definition of a low-level offender, a small-time crook. No one looked deeper. No one connected the dots between a string of unsolved murders in Florida and a string of unsolved murders in California, because the dots were separated by thousands of miles and decades of time. The beginning of the end for Samuel Little did not come with a dramatic shootout or a high-speed chase. It came with a routine arrest. In the autumn of a year just over a decade ago, Little was arrested at a homeless shelter in a Kentucky city and extradited to California to face a narcotics charge. It was a mundane charge for a career criminal, the kind of thing he had faced 100 times before. But this time, something was different. In California, authorities were looking at him for something far more serious. They had a DNA match. Advances in forensic science, particularly the use of familial DNA in the national database known as CODIS, had finally caught up with him. DNA evidence from 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the 1980s had been linked to him. The ghost finally had a name. The case against Samuel Little in Los Angeles was strong. The DNA was incontrovertible. He stood trial for the murders of 2 of the women. The trial was a formality. He was convicted and sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For most serial killers, this would have been the end of the story. They would be locked away, their secrets dying with them, their full tally of victims a mystery forever. But Samuel Little was not like most serial killers. Behind bars, with no hope of freedom, something inside him began to shift. Perhaps it was the weight of his crimes, a burden too heavy to carry alone. Perhaps it was a twisted form of ego, a desire to be recognized for the scale of his evil. Violence fueled by a rage he could not explain and a compulsion he could not control. He told investigators that he killed, on average, once a month, sometimes more. He was not a monster who lost control, he was a monster who was always in control, choosing his moments and his victims with cold, calculating precision. The confessions forced a nationwide reckoning. Police departments from coast to coast began reopening cold cases, files that had been gathering dust for years. They cross-referenced Little's detailed accounts with their own unsolved murders. The results were staggering. Case after case was closed, not with new DNA evidence or a surprise witness, but with the words of the killer himself. Families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, finally got an answer, however painful. The women who had been dismissed as drug addicts or runaways were finally recognized as victims of a brutal predator. Their names were cleared, their stories were told, and their deaths were officially recorded as what they were: murder. Samuel Little's confessions did more than just close cases. They rewrote the history of serial murder in America. He confessed to 93 killings, a number that dwarfed the toll of any other known serial killer in the nation's history. He shattered the myth of the organized serial killer, the meticulous planner who leaves a trail of clues for a brilliant profiler to follow. Little was disorganized in his movements, but methodical in his killing. He was a product of the margins, a killer who thrived on the invisibility of his victims. His story exposed the deep-seated biases in law enforcement and the media, the tendency to value some lives more than others. He was able to kill for so long not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because he was killing people that society had already decided didn't matter.